Hello, Lindsay Wilson. This is Mason Dyer. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs with the Association of Independent Kentucky Colleges and Universities, or IQ as we like to say. IQ is your member organization. We're the member organization for all 18 of Kentucky's private nonprofit four-year colleges and universities. So Lindsay, Campbellsville University, University of Pikeville, Center College, Berea College, Bellarmine University, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bore you by naming all 18 of them. But we are your advocates. We advocate on behalf of policies that are beneficial to independent college students and institutions. We're your voice in Frankfort and in Washington, and we generally try and promote and further the cause of independent higher education. I won't talk too much more about us in general. I do want to try and keep this brief since you're probably a little zoomed out after the last year, and I'm really looking forward to our at least our interactive Q&A portion and the next time that I can visit on campus. Lindsay Wilson's always one of my favorite campuses to visit. You've got a great community there, great culture, great people, and of course a beautiful campus down there in God's country. So want to talk to you a little bit today about communication and change and the power of networks as you're dealing with change. Certainly last year with the onset of the pandemic, higher ed was facing circumstances we'd never seen before. Unprecedented is my least favorite word after the year we've had, but it really was something that we've never seen before and we don't want to see again, quite frankly. But as things began to shut down last year, IQ realized that we had to kind of change the way that we had been doing business. In the past, we had built community and networks amongst our member groups. I convene a lot of those groups. So all of the deans of students, Dean Schmidt and his peers would meet generally once a year in person on a campus somewhere. The chief academic officers like Dr. Parrish and her colleagues would meet a couple of times a year. All the CFOs would meet a couple of times a year, the IT directors, and on and on and on. And a lot of those groups I meet with. But what we quickly saw, and I think this is probably universally true, you all, I'm sure, observe this, that in times of great uncertainty, there are a couple of things that are extremely valuable for leaders: information and connection. And as part of those, very closely tied to making these work, trust and value. So we were quickly pivoting the way that we operated to ensure that we could help our member institutions get the information that they needed to make decisions quickly as things were changing by the day. And then to build the connection amongst the different groups to strengthen those and help fill in the gaps of information there. So we're collecting information, what's going on at the state level, what's coming out of the governor's office, what's coming down from the federal level, the CDC, as all of this stuff is starting last March. At the same time, we began quickly pivoting to an online world, just like you all did, and setting up Zoom meetings. So I spent, and have for the last year, spent a lot of time, I've not gone back through my calendar, but I've spent hundreds of hours in Zoom meetings with these different groups. So groups that maybe met twice a year or once a year before, we're suddenly meeting bi-weekly or once a month. And some of that has continued. Dean Schmidt has a group of deans of students that probably 8 or 10 of them consistently show up every 2 weeks to check in. And they've been able to build trust and connection and help each other solve problems. Part of those groups is building a sense of community, knowing that there are other people going through the same thing that you're going through. And I think that's incredibly valuable as you think about situations that you might face as leaders, being able to connect with peers. And there's an idea in social network theory within communications, and I won't bore you with too much of the theory, but this idea that networks are critical. And we talk a lot about them in terms of helping you find jobs, and that might be the way that you think of building your network. But once you have a job or you're in a position of leadership, developing that network and being able to call on those folks within your network is also critically important, because there are within network theory, one of the things that it posits is that there are strong ties, those people that you work closely with or that are part of your core group. Say, for instance, the leadership team at Lindsey Wilson College. They're all strongly connected. They have the same general set of experiences and references. And then over at, say, University of Pikeville, their executive team has a separate set of experiences, connections, and strong ties. And now the Dean of Students at University of Pikeville might know Dean Schmitty, and they might have a somewhat weaker tie, maybe it's a strong tie. But there's a gap between them. And oftentimes, the information that you need to make decisions can be filled in by bridging those gaps between networks. And that's where IQ comes in. We're the bridge, we're the connector. I can collect information and know that something that of value is happening at another institution, and say to somebody on the Lindsey Wilson team, well, you might want to talk to so-and-so at University of the Cumberlands and see how they're dealing with this. Or when we bring these groups together, the network starts to strengthen, the trust begins to build, and they start to open up. And part of my role, beyond just setting the meeting, facilitating the conversation, is digging in and asking the questions that draw people out to really kind of underscore the way that they're handling some of these situations. So how are you dealing with commencement? What are you thinking about on the return to campus? What's your approach to testing? And then once people start talking and they begin learning from each other, well, this worked for us. This didn't work so well, but it might work on your campus. And to be clear, IQ has no authority. We have no control over any of these folks. So it's really in our best interest that they all connect and work together. And we help them fill in those gaps, missing information, by strengthening the bonds within those networks. And another key part of this is empathy. I don't know how much you've talked in your other leadership discussions about empathy, but one of the folks that I've really been interested in learning from recently is Brene Brown, who writes and speaks a lot about empathy and the power of vulnerability in creating strong leaders. And within these groups, they naturally foster empathy as you're hearing what other folks are going through and imagining how that plays out on your campus. Or in my case, I'm not on a campus, but understanding what they're dealing with. And that informs our advocacy efforts, and it informs our ability to go out and try and help them solve problems. For instance, last spring, with the quick shift to online learning, we quickly started hearing that faculty needed more training. They just, in many cases, had never been asked to teach online before. And so we were able to tap into our network. I reached out and I knew some things that were going on, some folks that had really strong training programs on campus. And we contracted with one of those other institutions to put on a course development institute for all of our member institutions. And we had about 40 faculty take part over the summer in preparing quickly to turn around and teach online in the spring. And that's just one example of pulling the power of that network, learning where the pain points are, and then taking those opportunities and building something out of those, and using that to drive leadership opportunities. And within these, we're certainly not, I'm no counselor, but I think it's important to be able to listen, and of course to express that empathy. And within these groups, and I'll take the Dean of Students group with where Dean Schmidt is as an example. I've seen some strong ties build over the last year within that network. Things that were, relationships that were weak ties before, there are now strong ties. And then I hear from that group fairly regularly that they've never felt closer to their colleagues around the state, and that those discussions are key to their ability to come back to their campus and make informed decisions to help you all, to make Lindsey Wilson a better place, or Campbellsville a better place, or Center a better place. And so networks have power. And as you're moving forward in your leadership journey, I encourage you to think about how you can bridge those gaps, how you can be the connector. So you may have strong ties within your team or within the Lindsey Wilson Singers, but how do you reach across groups that exist on campus to benefit your entire campus? Or when you're out in the work world, reaching across to other Lindsey Wilson alumni and then to other broader networks. So be the connector, bring the information, and have empathy. And I don't want to go too long, but I do want to leave you. This really doesn't quite fit into what I'm talking about, but this has been a key poem that I've been thinking about throughout this last year. And I really try and keep this in mind through all my interactions. And I encourage you to do the same as you're building your networks, as you're developing as leaders, but to think about, and I have to find it because this is a poem by Philip Larkin, who was a 20th century British poet. I think I put in my bio, I was a recovering English major. I was an English and history double major as an undergraduate. But this is something that I've come back to again and again with all the loss and the uncertainty of the last year. And I'll just draw your attention to these last two lines. Of each other, we should be kind while there is still time. And I leave you with that and look forward to talking with you in April.